The humming of fluorescent lights echoed softly through the empty halls of Hawthorne Blake LLP, one of the most prestigious law firms in Manhattan. At 11:43 p.m., long after most employees had left for the night, Jason Miller pushed a worn janitorial cart down the polished marble corridor of the 47th floor. His posture was slightly hunched, his movements slow but deliberate, the way someone might move if they were tired from years of hard labor. Dressed in a faded uniform with the name J. Miller stitched in cursive on the chest pocket, he looked every bit the invisible worker, just another face no one paid attention to, but behind those quiet eyes was a mind that registered everything with precision. Jason was not merely cleaning the office, he was watching. As he passed the firm's restricted access document room, a flicker of green light caught his attention. The keycard reader next to the door, which usually glowed red after hours, now blinked green. Jason slowed his steps, pretending to realign one of the squeaky cartwheels. Through the glass wall of the room, partially veiled by privacy film, he caught the faint outline of two figures inside. His pulse quickened, though his expression remained entirely neutral. After months of working here under this identity, he had learned how to blend in so completely that no one gave him a second glance. That invisibility, once merely an asset, was now his most dangerous weapon. Inside the room, William Carter, a senior litigation partner known for his ruthless court demeanor, stood beside Rachel Donovan, the firm's managing partner. Both were dressed immaculately despite the late hour. Carter in a crisp dark suit, Donovan in a silk blouse and heels that clicked sharply on the tiled floor. Jason watched silently as the two attorneys moved with calculated urgency, removing documents from file drawers and feeding them into a slim black leather briefcase. The documents weren't just any files. Jason had memorized the layout of the document room weeks ago, and he recognized the specific cabinet they were accessing. Those drawers held materials related to the Bennett case, a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit that had dominated internal discussions for months. Jason remained just out of view, adjusting the angle of his mop, then slowly making his way past the document room as if unaware of anything unusual. But every motion, every whispered word, every exchange between Carter and Donovan was being committed to memory. For the past 3 months, Jason had been working nights at Hawthorne Blake under the guise of a quiet janitor. But he wasn't there to scrub floors or empty trash cans. He was there to observe, to gather information, and to track the unexplained anomalies that had begun to surface in the firm's most high-profile litigation. What he saw that night would become the first major piece of a puzzle he had been quietly assembling. He moved to the break room down the hall and filled a mop bucket with water, careful to maintain the appearance of routine. Meanwhile, behind him, the two lawyers exited the document room, unaware they had been observed. Carter glanced up and nodded briefly as he passed Jason in the hallway, not recognizing the sharpness behind the janitor's eyes. Donovan followed closely behind, her face composed but pale. Jason gave a polite nod in return and resumed mopping, his face unreadable. The moment they disappeared down the elevator, he walked back toward the document room, noting the time, 11:47 p.m., and the blinking red light that had returned to the keycard reader. Whatever they had taken was gone. By the end of his shift, Jason had returned to the supply closet and quietly opened a small panel hidden behind the broom rack. Inside was a secure device, a compact tablet connected to a private network. He logged the details of the encounter, the time, the faces, the location of the documents, the briefcase model, and Carter's unusual use of a secondary badge. Each detail was saved with timestamps and encrypted. This was not just surveillance. This was preparation. Jason knew something deeper was happening at Hawthorne Blake, and tonight, for the first time, he had seen it with his own eyes. What Carter and Donovan didn't realize was that their midnight operation had just triggered the unraveling of everything they were trying to hide. Morning arrived with the usual rhythm at Hawthorne Blake LLP, sleek black sedans lined up in the underground garage, elevators filled with sleep-deprived associates juggling coffee and court documents, and the faint hum of office printers kicking into gear on every floor. But on this particular morning, that normal rhythm was shattered by 9 a.m. The executive floor, usually a temple of calm authority, had erupted into a chaotic scramble of phone calls, closed-door meetings, and whispered panic. Word spread quickly. The Bennett case files, critical documents in the firm's most valuable lawsuit, were missing. Entire folders, both digital and hard copy, had vanished from the document archives overnight. Rachel Donovan's heels clicked furiously as she stormed through the 47th floor, her tablet in hand and jaw clenched. William Carter followed close behind, his face a carefully maintained mask of controlled fury. In the main conference room, where junior attorneys had been gathering for a morning strategy meeting, the mood turned icy as the news sank in. The Bennett case, involving a $1.4 billion corporate settlement, had not only brought prestige to the firm, it had also made them a target. Now, with the files gone, Hawthorne Blake was facing both an internal crisis and the very real possibility of legal disaster. "This is impossible," Carter barked, slamming his hand against the edge of the table. "That room is under lock and key after hours. No one gets in without clearance." Donovan tapped away on her tablet, pulling up the security access logs. "According to this," she said, her voice tight, "only maintenance staff had access after 10 p.m. That means janitorial entry. No one else." She looked up, eyes sharp and focused. "Let's check the security footage." A technician was summoned to the control room, and within minutes, grainy black and white footage played on a split-screen monitor. There was Jason Miller entering the document room at exactly 11:47 p.m. His usual time, his usual routine. The footage showed him standing inside for 2 minutes, adjusting something near the filing cabinets, then walking out, pushing his cart slowly down the hall. The angle was just skewed enough to obscure what he might have been doing, and the resolution was conveniently low. Carter's expression darkened. "It's him," he said flatly. "He's the only one who had access. He's the only one on the footage. This isn't a coincidence." Donovan nodded, her voice now calculated and cold. "We need to control this. Fast." Within the hour, the firm's internal tech team had edited the surveillance footage to further obscure any view of Carter and Donovan's presence the previous night. Small clips were clipped out, timestamps were blurred just enough to avoid suspicion. They replaced the original file in the system and marked it as verified. Then, with all the pieces of their cover story in place, they made the next move, contacting law enforcement. By early afternoon, Detective Laura Kim arrived on site, briefed by Carter and Donovan with rehearsed concern and carefully prepared evidence. The narrative was simple, convincing. Jason Miller, the night janitor, had been bribed or blackmailed by opposing counsel in the Bennett case to remove or sabotage critical documents. He had the access. He had the opportunity. And the footage, now doctored, seemed to support their theory. As the detective watched the video, she frowned slightly, but said nothing. Everything seemed too convenient. Still, protocol was protocol. "We'll need to speak with Mr. Miller," she said. At 3:12 p.m., Jason was found quietly cleaning the lobby windows. He turned calmly when approached, his face unreadable. "Mr. Miller," Detective Kim said, "we need you to come with us for questioning." Jason placed the spray bottle on the windowsill, wiped his hands on a rag, and met her gaze with unsettling steadiness. "Of course, Detective," he replied. As she led him away in handcuffs, the eyes of interns, partners, and associates followed, some with concern, others with judgment. William Carter and Rachel Donovan stood nearby, their expressions the perfect blend of feigned shock and grim duty. But as Jason stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, he reached into his pocket and tapped a concealed button on a device that looked like a janitorial remote. Across the building, hidden systems he had quietly installed over the past few months began uploading encrypted footage to an off-site server. The trap they thought they had set for him had just activated the real one, designed, calculated, and waiting to explode in truth. Jason Miller stood in the center of the marble-floored lobby, quietly wiping down a stainless steel trash bin when he noticed a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The conversation near the front desk fell silent. Footsteps, measured, firm, and purposeful, approached from behind. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. Detective Laura Kim, accompanied by two uniformed officers, came into view in the reflection of the glass partition. Her voice was calm but assertive. "Mr. Miller, I need to ask you to come with us for further questioning." Jason set his cleaning cloth down on the cart, straightened his posture, and nodded once. "Of course, Detective." There was no hesitation, no protest, just an eerie steadiness in his voice that made Kim raise an eyebrow, but only for a moment. As the officers moved to either side of him, Jason extended his arms, allowing them to place the cuffs on his wrists. Employees had begun to gather near the corners of the hallway, some peeking from their glass-walled offices, others whispering behind half-closed doors. To them, this was the climax of a scandal unraveling in real time. A trusted janitor caught in what they believed was the betrayal of the firm's most valuable case. The looks in their eyes varied: pity, suspicion, and in a few, thinly veiled satisfaction. For William Carter and Rachel Donovan, who stood on the mezzanine level with folded arms and carefully blank expressions, it was the moment they had engineered to perfection. But what they couldn't see, what no one could, was the silent click that occurred when Jason's thumb pressed a seemingly innocuous button on his janitor's remote control. Beneath the surface of Hawthorne and Blake, a network of high-definition hidden cameras, motion-triggered microphones, and data backup nodes came to life, installed over months, hidden in air vents, behind light fixtures, and within access control panels. These surveillance systems began transmitting their recorded contents to a secure server outside the firm's firewall. Every hallway whisper, every midnight meeting, every moment of Carter and Donovan's deception was now being uploaded, verified, and time-stamped. The button Jason had pressed didn't just trigger the upload, it also silently activated the failsafe, ensuring that nothing could be altered, blocked, or deleted from this point forward. For months, he had played the role of the unnoticed. Now that invisibility was finally doing its real work. Detective Kim walked Jason out of the building with an air of procedural calm. "You're not under arrest yet," she said in a lowered voice, almost as if offering him a thread of reassurance. "But we need to clarify your role in the handling of certain case materials." Jason nodded, offering no resistance, but his eyes flicked toward the firm's entrance one last time. His gaze met Donovan's briefly, hers cold and triumphant. Then Carter's, smug, assured. Neither of them suspected a thing. They believed the trap they had set had worked, that their manipulation of evidence, security footage, and firm politics had been executed flawlessly. But that belief, like everything else they'd built, was a fabrication. Jason knew exactly how long it would take for their story to start unraveling, and it had already begun. At the precinct, Jason was processed like any other suspect. Fingerprints, a mugshot, standard intake procedure. But even the officers handling the paperwork noted something odd. He was unusually composed, not just calm, but observant. He watched each movement, remembered names, tracked timestamps. It was the kind of behavior Detective Kim had only ever seen in seasoned professionals or high-level military operatives. And yet, here he was, a man in custodial uniform, saying very little, requesting nothing. When asked if he needed a lawyer, Jason simply said, "Whoever is assigned will do," and then returned to silence. But in his mind, he wasn't thinking about lawyers. He was counting down. Every move from now on was part of a larger strategy, and every hour brought the next piece closer to falling into place. Back at the firm, Carter and Donovan celebrated quietly behind closed doors. "The board will see this as damage control," Carter said, swirling a glass of scotch. "We moved quickly. We protected the firm." Donovan leaned against the credenza, crossing her arms. "Once he's charged, no one will question the case's delay, or its dismissal. He's the perfect scapegoat." They toasted their success, still unaware that their every word, every step, and every decision over the past 3 months had been monitored. And now all of it was in the hands of the man they thought they had destroyed. Jason Miller, the quiet janitor, the man they believed too low to matter, had just moved his first piece on the board, and the endgame had already begun. The courtroom was packed with onlookers by the time Jason Miller was led in through the side entrance in a muted orange jumpsuit. The murmur of whispered conversations echoed through the gallery like soft thunder, bouncing off the high ceilings and wood-paneled walls of courtroom 3C. At the front, Judge Marianne Holloway, a seasoned veteran known for her no-nonsense demeanor, reviewed the docket with a sharp eye. On the prosecution side sat William Carter and Rachel Donovan, polished and confident, with their team of junior associates in tailored suits and boxes of so-called evidence stacked beside them. To the untrained eye, it looked like an airtight case. To Jason, it looked like a play, with actors who had spent weeks rehearsing their lines. Brian Elliott, Jason's public defender, rose clumsily from his seat as the judge called the case. His tie was crooked, his legal pad half filled with unreadable scribbles, and his shoulders sagged under the pressure of facing a pair of the most formidable attorneys in New York. Carter began with a statement that dripped with theatrical flair. "Your Honor, what we're dealing with is no simple theft. This is an act of calculated corporate espionage, executed by a man who used his position of trust to undermine the very foundation of our justice system." He gestured toward Jason with deliberate disdain. Mr. Miller had access, Mr. Miller had motive, and Mr. Miller had help, connections we will expose during the course of this trial. Rachel Donovan took over the technical side of the presentation, introducing grainy surveillance footage that showed Jason entering the document room at precisely 11:47 p.m. She laid out falsified financial records, including alleged offshore deposits under Jason's name, and produced fabricated email logs suggesting communication between him and a rival firm's paralegal. Each piece was presented with polished confidence, each fact supported by charts, graphs, and timelines that appeared to create a seamless narrative of betrayal. The courtroom absorbed it all. The jurors sat still, taking notes. Even Judge Holloway leaned slightly forward during Donovan's calm, rehearsed delivery. Meanwhile, Brian Elliott fumbled with his notes. His objections were weak, his cross-examinations rushed. He couldn't keep up with the pace the prosecution had set, and each time he rose to speak, it was met with half-hidden smirks from the prosecution table. Jason remained quiet throughout, hands folded on the defense table, his gaze fixed, not on the jury, not even on his accusers, but on the rhythm of the courtroom itself. He was watching, noting the way Carter shifted when flustered, how Donovan tapped her pen twice before introducing doctored data, and the way Brian's voice cracked under pressure. But most importantly, he was watching Detective Laura Kim, seated in the gallery with her notepad on her lap, not writing, just observing. Detective Kim had been following the case since the day of Jason's arrest. Initially, the evidence seemed sound, overwhelming even, but something gnawed at her. The timing of everything felt too precise. The video footage, while technically admissible, had visual glitches right at the key moments. The banking records were unusually clean for a supposed conspiracy. The testimonies from firm employees all echoed the same language, as if rehearsed. And Jason's demeanor. It didn't align with a man caught red-handed. He didn't sweat, didn't twitch, didn't lash out. Instead, he seemed almost too calm, like a man waiting for someone to catch up. As the prosecution wrapped their first day, confidence radiated from Carter and Donovan like a spotlight. The courtroom recessed, and whispers filled the air like static. Reporters scribbled headlines. Jury members avoided eye contact. And yet, in the back row, Detective Kim remained still, replaying the day's events in her mind. She had seen enough trials to know what real guilt looked like. Raw, messy, reactive. This case? It was too clean, too curated, too theatrical. She wasn't sure what Jason Miller was hiding, but she was beginning to suspect it wasn't guilt. And in that growing silence of uncertainty, Jason leaned back in his chair, eyes still, expression unreadable, exactly as planned. The second day of the trial began with the same level of media frenzy as the first. reporters lining the courthouse steps, interns from nearby law schools sneaking into the back rows, and cameras clicking as William Carter and Rachel Donovan strutted through security with their entourage in tow. But inside the courtroom, the atmosphere had subtly shifted. While the prosecution remained confident, even smug, there was an undercurrent of tension that pulsed beneath their perfect tailoring and rehearsed remarks. The reason was sitting silently at the defense table, hands folded, a leather-bound notebook in front of him, and an expression as unreadable as ever. Jason Miller, the janitor, the accused, the enigma, was no longer simply watching. He was preparing. Throughout the morning, Carter and Donovan continued their methodical presentation of fabricated evidence. They introduced email chains allegedly linking Jason to contacts within a rival firm, metadata from financial transfers into an offshore account, and witness statements from junior employees claiming to have overheard him discussing compromising documents. It was a carefully woven tapestry of deception, and to the untrained eye, it looked seamless. But Jason wasn't just taking notes. He was analyzing. With every document shown, he jotted down inconsistencies. With every testimony, he tracked eye movements, tone, and the subtle tells that marked a lie rehearsed too many times. Even the jury began to glance at him differently, intrigued by the quiet man who never flinched, never objected, just wrote. The notebook became a symbol of sorts, an anomaly in a courtroom overflowing with digital screens and printed exhibits. Jason's handwriting was impossibly neat, with margins, bullets, and underlined phrases that read like a strategy briefing, not the scribbles of a janitor. Detective Laura Kim noticed, too. From her place in the gallery, she observed how he tracked timelines, cross-referenced dates, and corrected the prosecution's claims without uttering a single word. It was subtle, but powerful. Each page he turned added weight to a suspicion that had been growing inside her since the arrest. This man was not overwhelmed. He was methodical, focused, and dangerous in a way Carter and Donovan had failed to anticipate. After lunch recess, the prosecution introduced their most damning piece of evidence yet. A video clip that showed Jason entering the document room at 11:47 p.m., followed by a brief blackout in the footage, and then a reappearance, alone, carrying what appeared to be a folder. The jury leaned forward. Carter paused for dramatic effect, then nodded toward the screen. "There's your thief," he declared. "Caught in the act." Brian Elliott, still visibly out of his depth, stood slowly to cross-examine, but stumbled over technical terms and failed to question the missing frames in the footage. The moment could have sealed the case for the prosecution, but then, from the defense table, Jason did something unexpected. He raised his hand. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady and controlled. "With all due respect to Mr. Elliott's service, I would like to request permission to speak on my own behalf." A hush fell over the courtroom. Carter smiled, assuming it was desperation setting in. Judge Holloway, slightly taken aback, adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Miller, are you certain?" Jason nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe I have information that will shift the understanding of this case." The judge studied him for a long moment. She had seen defendants try to hijack their own defense before, usually a last-ditch effort to salvage their pride. But something in Jason's tone wasn't pride, it was precision. She granted the request with a simple nod. "Proceed." Jason stood slowly, buttoning the top of his jumpsuit like a man dressing for battle. The air in the courtroom thickened, reporters clicked their pens in anticipation, and Carter leaned back with smug amusement. But Detective Kim sat forward, pen paused above her notepad. Something was coming. Jason placed his notebook carefully on the evidence table, looked at the judge, the jury, and finally the prosecution. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you've been told a story, crafted, rehearsed, and engineered to make me look like the villain. But that story has cracks. And today, I intend to show you every one of them." In that moment, the courtroom, once a stage for Carter and Donovan's performance, became Jason Miller's arena, and the truth was about to begin its march. Jason stood at the center of courtroom 3C, his prison-issued jumpsuit now seeming less like a symbol of guilt and more like the camouflage of a master strategist. His tone remained even, but each word he spoke carried a weight that slowly peeled back the illusion the prosecution had worked so hard to create. He walked calmly to the evidence table, opened his leather notebook, and withdrew a manila envelope labeled simply Exhibit A. Inside was a professionally bound document bearing the Hawthorne Blake firm letterhead, stamped, signed, and notarized 3 days prior to the alleged theft. This, Jason announced, is a complete and unaltered copy of the Bennett case file, the same file that I've been accused of stealing and destroying. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Even Judge Holloway leaned forward. Jason handed the folder to the bailiff, who delivered it to the bench. Please turn to page 417, Jason continued, and note the timestamp and certification seal at the bottom. The judge flipped through the document, her eyes narrowing. This copy, she confirmed aloud, was signed, encrypted, and verified through the firm's digital authentication system before the theft was reported. Rachel Donovan visibly stiffened, her lips pressed into a line. William Carter's jaw tensed, the blood draining from his face. Jason's eyes scanned the courtroom, not arrogantly, but with quiet assurance. The cracks had widened. Now came the collapse. Jason walked to a nearby laptop that had been used by the prosecution earlier. Your Honor, he said, I'd like to introduce Exhibit B, a complete and unedited surveillance recording from the night of March 15th. Carter leapt to his feet. Objection. This footage wasn't submitted during discovery. Jason didn't flinch. Because it wasn't in my possession until this morning. It was held by an independent escrow agency, to be released only if I was charged. He produced the chain of custody documentation, which the bailiff promptly delivered to Judge Holloway. She reviewed the file, then gave a single nod. Proceed. A large screen flickered to life. The timestamp on the video matched the exact time cited in the prosecution's edited footage. The image was crisp, far more detailed than the grainy clip Carter and Donovan had shown. The courtroom watched in rapt silence as William Carter and Rachel Donovan were clearly seen entering the document room together at 11:43 p.m. Carter's voice rang out clearly through the audio feed. We wipe this now. It's over. No one will know. Donovan replied, We've already corrupted the backups. This is the last hard copy. The two were seen removing multiple file folders and stuffing them into a leather briefcase. There was no ambiguity, no room for doubt. The video paused with a still frame of the two attorneys staring directly into the camera. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Jason turned back toward the bench. You may be wondering how this footage exists, he said. The official surveillance system was compromised, as we've seen, but this recording came from a secondary system, authorized, installed, and monitored by the firm's executive board 3 months ago as part of an internal audit. He presented a signed authorization form bearing the names of 3 board members, confirming that the hidden surveillance was part of a confidential investigation into irregularities tied to several high-profile cases. This system wasn't unauthorized, Jason said quietly. It was simply unknown to those who had something to hide. Carter looked like he'd been struck across the face. Donovan sat frozen, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Judge Holloway stared at the footage still frozen on the screen. Mr. Miller, she said slowly, this is damning evidence, but I assume there's more. Jason nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. But before I continue, I'd like to clarify something. My name is not Jason Miller. He reached into the folder again and pulled out a sealed envelope. My name is Michael Andrews, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of Hawthorne Blake LLP. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The guard standing near Jason visibly stiffened. The judge leaned back in stunned silence. For the past 8 months, Michael continued, I have operated undercover in my own firm to uncover corruption. What you've seen today is just the beginning. The trial, once a carefully staged performance, had just been flipped on its head, and the real story was only now coming to light. The screen faded to black for only a moment before the next clip began to play. This one darker, the timestamp reading March 14th, 12:02 a.m. The camera angle was fixed on the interior of a private conference room deep within the Hawthorne and Blake offices. The audio crackled before resolving into crystal clarity. William Carter stood near the window, back turned to the lens, while Rachel Donovan sat at the table, nervously tapping her pen. Another figure entered the frame briefly, his face concealed, but the voice was unmistakably Carter's. $2 million. That's what they're offering. Cash. No trace. Donovan looked up, voice low but clear. And all we have to do is make the Bennett case disappear. The words hung in the air like a guillotine's blade. The courtroom sat in absolute silence, all eyes locked on the screen as the recording continued. We pin it on the janitor, Carter said. He's invisible. Nobody questions the guy who cleans the trash. Donovan nodded. The footage? I can have tech redacted. I've already prepared the shell account. The offshore bank will hold the funds until we release confirmation. The video zoomed slightly, catching Carter's face in full for the first time as he leaned across the table. Once this is done, we walk away clean. No trail, no doubts. We blame Miller, and the whole case collapses. Judge Holloway reached for her pen but paused mid-air, her hand trembling ever so slightly. In over 30 years on the bench, she had never witnessed a moment like this. Jason, now fully revealed as Michael Andrews, CEO of the very firm that Carter and Donovan had tried to hijack, didn't even glance at the prosecution table as he stepped back to the center of the courtroom. He opened a second folder, marked Exhibit C, and withdrew a series of printed documents. The footage was just the beginning, he said evenly. What you're looking at now are financial records tracing the movement of funds from a private account registered in the Cayman Islands to shell corporations connected to Carter and Donovan. He handed the documents to the bailiff. Included are emails, encrypted transfers, and internal firm correspondence intercepted during our surveillance. All of it leads back to them. He turned back to the gallery, eyes scanning the stunned faces of jurors, interns, and reporters alike. But it goes deeper, he continued. We have proof of jury tampering, communications between Carter's associate and a juror's brother, involving untraceable cryptocurrency payments routed through blockchain tumblers. Audible gasps rippled through the courtroom. And further still, he said, we discovered collusion between Carter's office and known affiliates of organized crime, one of whom was seen entering a side entrance to our building 2 weeks before the file theft. Michael lifted a final document, an affidavit from a federal cybersecurity specialist confirming the authenticity of the evidence. They didn't just sabotage a case, they infiltrated the very justice system they claimed to serve. At the prosecution table, Rachel Donovan sat frozen, her pen resting limp in her fingers. Carter, pale and wide-eyed, leaned forward slowly as if trying to retreat into his own shadow. Even their junior associates looked away, ashamed or stunned. Detective Laura Kim stood quietly at the back of the room, arms crossed, her face unreadable but her mind racing. She had suspected something was off from the beginning, but nothing had prepared her for this scale of corruption. Michael turned toward her. Detective Kim, he said gently, I believe now would be the appropriate time. She nodded once and stepped forward, signaling 2 court officers who began to move silently down the aisle. As the video ended and the final exhibits were distributed, the tension in the room gave way to something else. Shock, yes, but also a kind of collective awe. The janitor had just dismantled a criminal conspiracy in open court. The man they had all underestimated, mocked, or ignored had orchestrated one of the most brilliant undercover operations the legal system had ever witnessed. Carter and Donovan didn't speak. They didn't move. They simply sat there, no longer untouchable architects of their own narrative, but exposed conspirators caught in a trap so precise it left no room for escape. And at the center of it all stood Michael Andrews, calm, composed, and unshaken, as the truth he had so patiently gathered finally burned through every lie. The silence that followed Michael's last statement was unlike anything the courtroom had experienced before, not the tense anticipation of argument, not the hushed whispers of disbelief, but a complete, profound stillness. The judge, the jury, the prosecution, and every observer in the gallery sat suspended in a moment that felt both surreal and inevitable. All eyes turned to the man who, only days ago, had been perceived as nothing more than a quiet janitor pushing a mop down the polished hallways of a law firm. But now, standing tall in the middle of courtroom 3C, his jumpsuit suddenly seemed like a disguise that no longer fit. He reached into his case one final time and pulled out an identification badge, holding it up for the court to see. "Your Honor," he said, voice calm but firm, "my name is Michael Andrews. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Hawthorne Blake LLP." Gasps filled the room like a wave crashing against stone. Judge Holloway's gavel struck twice, demanding silence, but the energy in the courtroom had shifted irreversibly. "That's impossible," Carter shouted, leaping to his feet. "Michael Andrews is in Europe on medical leave. We've received documents, video calls, his signature." Michael turned to him with quiet clarity. "Every signature, every document, every video you received was designed to preserve the illusion that I was absent. In reality, I was here the entire time, watching, learning, documenting." He took a step forward, his voice rising just slightly. 8 months ago, I began noticing discrepancies, client accounts that didn't add up, case files accessed at odd hours, settlements that benefited the opposition in inexplicable ways. He looked toward the gallery, scanning the faces of junior associates, paralegals, interns, some who had spoken against him, others who had simply turned a blind eye. I knew something was rotting within this firm, but traditional audits failed to find the source. So I stepped down, disappeared into the background, and re-entered the firm not as its leader, but as its most invisible employee. He paused. As a janitor, no one hid their secrets from me. I emptied their trash, stood quietly during their conversations, and accessed the same hallways they assumed were safe. And what I found, he gestured to the files, the footage, the exhibits around the room, was far worse than I imagined. At that moment, the courtroom doors opened behind the gallery. A wave of movement swept through the room as FBI agents entered, calm, professional, and purposeful. At the front of their group was Agent David Porter, the very same man who had posed as Jason's bumbling public defender. He no longer wore the ill-fitting suit or slouched shoulders. His presence was commanding now, and as he approached the bench, he raised his badge. "Your Honor," he said clearly, "I am Special Agent Porter with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mr. Andrews has been working with us on an 8-month joint operation to uncover systemic corruption at Hawthorne Blake." Before the judge could respond, Agent Porter nodded to his team. In an instant, agents surrounded William Carter and Rachel Donovan, their shocked expressions frozen in place. "William Carter, Rachel Donovan," Porter announced, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct justice, corporate fraud, jury tampering, and money laundering." Rachel's knees buckled slightly, and she grabbed the edge of the table. Carter turned to bolt, but 2 agents were already blocking the exit. The clinking of handcuffs echoed through the hushed courtroom as the 2 were restrained. One by one, other staff members were also identified, those who had aided the scheme, looked the other way, or accepted dirty money to stay quiet. Michael stood still as the arrests unfolded around him, the storm of the past 8 months finally erupting in a symphony of accountability. But beneath the surface of justice, there was sadness too, a mourning for the firm he had once built with pride, now poisoned by ambition and greed. As the agents led Carter and Donovan away, Agent Porter turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, we'll also be executing warrants for additional arrests based on the evidence Mr. Andrews has provided. This conspiracy was not limited to 2 individuals." The judge nodded solemnly. "Mr. Andrews," she said, addressing Michael directly, "I believe it's time we heard the full scope of what you've uncovered." Michael looked around the courtroom, now transformed from a stage of accusation into a platform of truth. and nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I believe it's time we finish this. With Carter and Donovan now in custody, the courtroom remained suspended in stunned silence. The tension hadn't dissipated. It had only shifted. It was no longer about suspicion or blame. Now it was about reckoning. Michael Andrews, no longer hiding behind the name Jason Miller, stepped forward again and placed a thick black binder on the evidence table. Its cover was unmarked, but its contents would soon rock the entire legal community. Your Honor, he began, addressing Judge Cynthia Reynolds, who had just resumed the bench following the chaos. What we uncovered goes far beyond the Bennett case. This wasn't a single breach. It was a system of corruption that infected the very soul of this firm. He opened the binder and began to distribute copies of its contents to the court. Contained here are detailed breakdowns of 17 major cases handled by Hawthorne Blake over the past 2 years. Each one includes evidence of altered deposition transcripts, fabricated financial disclosures, suppressed discovery materials, and, in some instances, outright destruction of exculpatory evidence. Gasps rippled through the room once more as the documents were handed to the judge, prosecutors, and federal agents. This, Michael continued, is not speculation. It is verified, time-stamped, cross-checked, and witnessed. For each of these cases, we've included source data, chain of custody records, and testimony from whistleblowers, some of whom were junior staffers intimidated into silence. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room like a storm cloud. I want it to be clear, he added. This operation was not about vengeance. It was about truth. When I began noticing irregularities, I initiated internal audits. But Carter and Donovan were too clever. They knew how to cover their tracks. Standard oversight wasn't enough. Had I launched a conventional investigation, they would have buried every trace before I could blink. He stepped away from the binder and clasped his hands behind his back. So I made a choice: to become invisible. I walked away from my title, my corner office, and my name. I let them think they were untouchable. And in doing so, I saw everything. Across the courtroom, attorneys who had once held senior positions in the firm now sat with downcast eyes, some ashamed, others quietly panicking. Several were named in the binder. Others were implicated by proximity, either knowingly or by willful ignorance. Michael scanned the room again. I saw partners falsifying client reports. I saw interns pressured into compliance. I saw trust weaponized and justice for sale. And every time I pushed that mop down the hallways, I listened. Every time I emptied a trash bin, I checked what was discarded. What you see here today wasn't built in a day. It was built night after night, step by step, in silence. His voice never rose, yet every word seemed to echo off the walls like a gavel. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, her reading glasses resting on the tip of her nose as she flipped through the compiled evidence. The lines on her face deepened as she read, each page revealing deeper levels of misconduct and deception. Finally, she looked up, her voice measured and grave. Mr. Andrews, she said, in all my years on the bench, I have never seen an operation of this scale, neither in scope nor execution. She removed her glasses and folded her hands. The courage it took to live this double life, the discipline it required to remain patient under such pressure. It is truly extraordinary. This court owes you a debt of gratitude, not just for uncovering corruption, but for reminding us what integrity looks like in its purest form. Michael lowered his head in acknowledgement, but didn't linger in the praise. Thank you, Your Honor, he said. But this isn't about me. This is about the clients whose cases were mishandled, the families denied justice, and the faith in our legal system that was betrayed. He turned back to the gallery, where many members of the public now sat in stunned silence. What happens next isn't just a cleanup, it's a reckoning. And it starts here, today, with transparency and accountability. The room, once filled with murmurs of judgment and assumption, now sat still and humbled. What had begun as a prosecution had become a revelation. And in the middle of it all stood a man once dismissed as a janitor, now revealed as the architect of one of the most daring integrity operations in modern legal history. The sound of Judge Cynthia Reynolds' gavel echoed through courtroom 3C with the finality of a chapter closing. The murmurs had quieted, the spectacle had ended, and what remained was the solemn weight of justice, firm, unshakable, and overdue. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, she declared, her voice as crisp as the documents she had just reviewed, this court orders the immediate disbarment proceedings for William Carter and Rachel Donovan. Gasps rippled through the gallery, though no one was truly surprised anymore. Furthermore, she continued, the court refers all presented material to the U.S. Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation for formal prosecution under federal law. She turned toward the agent still standing at attention. I trust these matters will be pursued swiftly and thoroughly. Agent Porter stepped forward, nodding respectfully. They already are, Your Honor. Additional charges are pending against several individuals listed in the submitted evidence. Arrests will continue into the following week as the investigation expands. All court officers moved silently to escort several other attorneys out of the courtroom, their heads bowed as the weight of exposure finally caught up with them. Some had once held corner offices and managed million-dollar portfolios. Now they were suspects, stripped of the power they had so carelessly abused. The facade of authority had crumbled, and behind it stood a legacy of deceit that could no longer hide in shadow. At the center of it all, Michael Andrews stood quietly, no longer the man in the jumpsuit, nor the janitor with the mop, but the CEO of a firm undergoing rebirth. The judge turned her attention to him one last time. "Mr. Andrews," she said, softening slightly, "you have my deepest respect. Not just for the risks you took, but for the restraint you showed in carrying them out. You could have exposed this mess at any time, but you waited until the truth had no escape." Michael nodded. "It wasn't enough to uncover the lies," he said. "I needed to build a case so complete that justice wouldn't just be possible, it would be undeniable." He turned slightly toward the gallery, where the firm's remaining loyal staff watched him, many with tears in their eyes. And now, the real work begins. Outside the courthouse, a sea of reporters waited, microphones raised, cameras flashing. But Michael didn't stop to speak. He walked calmly past the chaos, briefcase in hand, flanked by a few trusted colleagues and federal agents. "Where to, sir?" one of them asked quietly. Michael looked up at the sky for a moment, soft clouds moving gently above the courthouse steps. "Back to the office," he said. "There's a firm to rebuild." That afternoon, a memo went out to every client whose case had been compromised. Personalized apologies, plans for restitution, pledges of transparency. Hawthorne Blake would no longer be a name built on prestige. It would be rebuilt on truth. As Michael stepped into the firm's building for the first time as himself in nearly 8 months, the staff fell silent. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. He didn't speak at first, just nodded at familiar faces, most of whom had once passed him by without a second glance. He walked to the executive floor, entered his old office, and stood by the window, looking out over the city. The skyline hadn't changed, but everything else had. On his desk sat the mop he had carried for months, placed there by someone with a quiet sense of humor and deep respect. He smiled faintly, walked over, and rested a hand on the handle. It wasn't just a tool. It was a symbol, a reminder. Justice doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it carries a mop. Sometimes it walks past you in silence, picking up the pieces left behind by those who thought they were too powerful to be seen. But justice sees everything. And in the end, it doesn't shout, it waits. And when the time is right, it steps forward not with rage, but with truth. As the sun dipped behind the buildings and the firm's lights turned on one by one, Michael stood tall in his office, knowing the hardest part was still ahead. But this time he wouldn't be alone. He had truth, he had integrity, and he had a promise to keep, to restore what was broken and to make sure it never fell again. If this story moved you, if it made you question the mask people wear, or reminded you that integrity often hides in plain sight, then you belong here with us at Deep Inside HQ. We tell stories that don't just entertain, but challenge the way we see justice, power, and truth. Because sometimes the hero isn't wearing a tie or holding a briefcase. Sometimes he's pushing a mop. Subscribe now to join our growing community of listeners who believe that real change begins with one bold act of courage. Your next favorite story is already unfolding. Don't miss it.